Anyway, normally we would do the reading first and then have a sermon, but Romans 3 is tricky. It's tricky because it is one of the most fundamental aspects of our faith. It is incredibly dense. St. Paul covers in one sentence the entirety of the history of Israel, for example. And so I think it would be better if we actually just read through it kind of verse by verse, section by section, and talk about it. There are some historical context stuff that you need to know. There are actually some translation issues here. And so rather than hearing it read and then preaching about it, we're going to explore together. So I encourage you on page 3, whatever you have, I have the different bulletin, to follow along as we go through it. So Paul begins on verse 9. He says, "What shall we conclude then? Are we," he's talking about them, the Jewish people, "any better? Not at all. We have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God." Now, up until this point, Paul has been trying to make a case that the distinction that had historically been made between the Jewish people, the people who bear the covenant promise of God through Father Abraham, and the Gentile people are actually on the same playing field. They're on the same level before God. And this would have been radical, especially for the Jewish people, because their entire history has been one of being the people of the promise, that God made a covenant with their father Abraham, and that all of the world will be put to rights, will be healed and restored, including all of humanity, through the descendants of Father Abraham. So they were set apart, they were special. And then the Gentiles were kind of weird and filthy, and they served a whole bunch of other gods. But, as Paul has pointed out, that history isn't quite clear-cut. Israel has a very checkered past of violating the covenant that God made with their people. So one of the ways that you can talk about the language made between God and the Jews is one of a marriage. A marriage is a special kind of covenant, and some of the prophets talk about this covenant as a marriage. And if you're married, then you probably know that you do not violate that covenant you have with your spouse if you forget to do the chores or don't do the dishes because you don't like to do them. That may or may not make you a jerk, or may just mean you're forgetful, but that doesn't violate a marriage. Infidelity does. And unfortunately, that was the problem for the Israelites, is that they would go after other gods. They would break that marriage vow. And so Paul, through these first 3 very dense chapters, has made the case that Jew and Gentile stand both condemned in this cosmic court of law in the defendant's seat. All right? So then he continues with verse 12. And he is drawing, by the way, from many different Psalms and other parts of the Hebrew Bible. He says, "All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes." Isn't that a wonderful, warm passage from the good book? I kind of imagine that would be an awesome, wedding verse or something like that, just because why not? No, so this is Paul laying out the indictment. Now imagine, and he uses this kind of language, and we'll see a good example of that in a second, of this cosmic law court, and God is judge, jury, and executioner. And in the defendant's seats, much to their surprise, Jew and Gentile stand accused. This would have been unthinkable before Paul and before Jesus kind of make this connection, but here it is. And they have to make this defense, and yet, in that diatribe there from 12 to 18, They have no defense. And there's a very real, powerful insight into human nature that we get here. And that is this. I am basically incapable of doing anything truly pure and righteous. So are you. Now, that doesn't mean I can't do good things. For example, maybe volunteering my time to a worthy cause. That's a good thing. But when the human heart enters into these actions, you have a problem because motivations have a tendency to disrupt a good deed. It's a good thing to volunteer your time. Is it a good thing to do that just because it makes you feel good? Iffy. What about if it feels good to have people notice that you're doing a good thing? Now you've got a problem. And unfortunately, with humanity, if you were to truly lay out your deepest, darkest thoughts and motives and ambitions and secrets, it would become apparent that everything we do, even the best that we have to offer, is tainted. It's corrupted. The Bible calls this sin. And so, as Paul lays out his argument, we have Jew and Gentile, all of humanity in the docks, in the defendant's seat, being accused by the prosecutor. And unfortunately, their defense is flimsy. So he continues. He says, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world be held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. Now, there are several deep insights into human nature right here. The first is that if you tell somebody not to do something, we have a tendency to then really want to do that. If you were to say, Eric, do not push this big red button, guess what I'm going to really desperately want to do? And I'll come up with all kinds of ways to, quote, justify that. Well, who are you? Are you the authority? Why? What's so wrong with this button? Can I press this button, please? I really want to. No, I think it's okay to push this button. It's a dumb example. But if you really want to see this in action, get a 4-year-old. Which is, in some ways, our truest self. But Paul says that every mouth may be silenced. Another way of saying that is stopped. And he has in mind an ancient court where the defendants are allowed to give state their case. They can give a defense. And in this ancient law court, when you are done laying out your defense, you will then, as a symbol of saying you're done, you'll put your hand over your mouth. However, there comes a point when a defendant is obviously guilty, is simply running his mouth because he doesn't realize that this is not a good idea, and then some further action has to take place. I imagine Judge Judy, which is like a guilty pleasure of mine whenever I'm in a waiting room for something. And, every episode there's always just that idiot who's clearly wrong and is running his mouth and saying, no, I didn't do this, even though I obviously, blah, blah, blah. And eventually, what does Judge Judy do? Hey, shut up. You're obviously guilty. Ruling in favor of the plaintiff. Done. Well, that could actually happen in Paul's day in a court. A prosecutor or magistrate, if a defendant is doing this, could, bam, smack him on the mouth. They would say that the defendant's mouth has been stopped. Or in this translation, silenced, as a way of saying, you're done, your case is rested, you've got nothing to justify yourself with. So he makes this argument that we now stand in this cosmic law court completely corrupted. We have no defense. An attempt to make a defense means that our mouths are going to get popped because we have nothing to offer for our defense. And Paul is drawing on an issue that has been coming up, and we can see this historically. Other Jewish writings are trying to make sense of it, especially the apocalyptic writings, that they have a sense of crisis. Okay, so if you're a good Jewish person, you're an Israelite, you are walking in the traditions of Father Abraham, you are waiting. Now, your people generations ago had been sent into exile for violating the law of God. And you've been returned to your home for a little while, and yet everything's still a mess. You're under the boot of a foreign authority. This law that you follow is not seeming to save you. That even if you're a good, upstanding religious person, you still have the sense that things are corrupt, that God has not yet done what he promised he would do. And if you can't trust God to do what he promised to do, you've got a really big problem. Now, there's an easy modern day example here. And this is, frankly, if I'm going to be honest, something that I struggle with in my faith, is that the world is a mess. It is an absolute mess. I have kind of a new ritual now when I wake up, and I don't wake up very quickly or very well. It just takes some time because that's how my brain is wired. But I'll kind of, reach over and grab my phone and flip on to some kind of news outlet and say, how is the world even messier now? And it usually revolves around U.S. politics. Now, do not hear a partisan statement here. I try very hard to conceal what I really think about it. But regardless of whether you're on the right or the left, you love or hate or whatever, this is a mess. This is crazy. And I can't help but think God, where are you? Psalm 13, how long, O Lord, will you hide your face from me? God, where's the justice that you promised? What is going on? Every single day, something is happening. Katie and I were talking about the Comey testimony, whenever that was. It feels like 6 months ago at this point. And we were just talking briefly, and Nash, our 4.5-year-old, said, what are you guys talking about? And it's like, you'll read about this in history in a few years, all right? Just wait. Because this world has gone nuts. And you can hear ancient Israelites, ancient Jews in Paul's day saying the same thing. God, where are you? Our people are still under foreign power. The world is a mess. Everyone is just as sinful as they always have been. This law that we try to follow is not doing it. It's only making us realize how inadequate we are. And that is where we land as human beings, that in our defendant's chair appearing before the judge, we have no case. We are guilty. Our mouths have been stopped. That the more we try to do what's right, the more we realize how incapable we are. And that's hard. And so now, Paul makes a really hard turn. He says in verse 21, but now. It's like a really, really hard turn. All right, we've got that said. Now we're going to talk about something else. But here we have a problem. There's a translation issue. Let's see, several weeks ago when we started this series, I said that when you see that phrase, the righteousness of God, in Greek that's dikaiosune theou, there is, that's actually, we think of righteousness of God as like a quality of God. He's a good God or something like that. And that's not wrong. But it's a way of talking about something else, a first century concept, which is referring to the fact that God is loyal and faithful to the covenants and promises that he made. So if you're a good Jew, you're thinking about the promise that he makes with Abraham, that even though Abraham's ancestors have royally messed it up, God is still faithful. God's righteousness is his faithfulness, his loyalty to his people. He is a God that keeps his promise. So we'll retranslate that. But now, God's loyalty to his people apart from the law, so this is outside the realm of behavior or religious observance or activity, has been made known. Okay, so God is faithful to his people. This has been made known. We might want to ask how. to which the law and the prophets testify. So we've got it referred to in the Hebrew Bible. This righteousness from God, this faithfulness, this loyalty that God has for his people comes through, and we have another translation issue. There's a whole bunch of scholarly debate. I fall on the other side of these translators. He says, the righteousness of God, God's loyalty to the covenant comes through not faith in Jesus, even though that's true, but rather, and if you're a nerd, this is called a subjective genitive, through the faithfulness of Jesus, the Messiah, to all who believe. So now let's take a step back and put that back together. God, in the way that he is going to be faithful and loyal to the promises that he has made, has revealed how he is going to do it. And this is how he is going to do it. He sends Jesus, his son, our Messiah, who is the faithful one. All throughout the traditions of Israel, the question has been, will Israel be faithful to the God that they love? And finally now in history, somebody has. God steps into our reality, into time and space. And this Jesus takes on this, we might call vocation, which is like just who you are and what you do. He lives the life that Israel was intended to live. He takes on this yoke of Torah, we may call it. He fulfills the law. He is everything that Israel was supposed to be because he is faithful to what God has commanded him to do. Now, this faithfulness ended up with a cost. For Jesus to be faithful to what God has told him to do, it ends up in his death. And we learn that this death is the result of all of this sin and darkness that humans are capable of. And it all kind of comes together to form this apex, this climactic moment where God's Messiah is crushed. He is crucified and he has died. But in this faithfulness, something happened. In this dramatic twist. And this, by the way, is the death in which we are baptized. We are buried with Jesus here. That when he is dead, death itself is condemned. The sin, that inability for us to do something right before God, the thing that keeps us from being able to say anything in our defense, has died also. And then in the moment that nobody saw coming, even death itself is reversed. God raises him from the dead. And if we are buried with Jesus in our baptism, we are raised with him in resurrection life. That those things like death and sin and darkness don't have power over us anymore. But it all comes down to the fact that God revealed his plan, his faithfulness, the way he's going to be loyal to the people that he loves. And it's by sending this faithful one, Jesus, and all of the fate of humanity, one way or another, is tied up in this one man. So now Paul says there is no difference. For all have sinned. You could easily translate that as for both have sinned, both Jew and Gentile, because that's the point Paul is making. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Which is true. We have nothing righteous to bring to God. And we are justified freely. Now that word justified, justice, and righteousness are all the same basic word in Greek. Dikaiao, dikaiosune, or dikaios. This is all, we are all declared right. Declared in the right, freely by his grace, through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus, the Messiah, Jesus. Now get what he is saying here. Go back to the law court. All of humanity is here. We've got the prosecutor, we have the judge, and God will judge. That is what a just God does. I saw in the mall a few days or weeks ago this shirt that boldly proclaimed, "Only God can judge me." And as I was looking at that, I had two thoughts. The first is, I feel like if you wear that shirt, you might lack self-awareness. Because it feels like if you're saying, only God can judge me, the next response is, yeah, but you're acting like a jerk. So, whatever. You're just using that to justify your own bad behavior. But second, while that's true, only God will judge, that should scare you. That is not a comforting thought. Remember, all of your ambitions, motives, deep, dark, secret thoughts, the kind of stuff that you would never share to anybody. Imagine that laid out on this table in this courtroom, and there it is, plain as day. Suddenly, God judging me is not an exciting prospect. But God showed us how he is faithful. He sent the faithful one who takes on the role of Israel, who takes on humanity. That faithfulness defeats sin and then even death itself. And as Paul rounds out verse 24, he gives us some good news that in the end, when God stands as judge before all of us, and he will, we know the verdict. His gavel hits the desk and he declares us not guilty. Dikaios, in the right, vindicated, justified. That now we live in this crazy moment where we know that one day we will stand before God as judge, but all of the sudden, because we have been buried with Jesus in our baptism, raised in his resurrection, that gavel will hit the ground and we will be declared not guilty. Not because we aren't guilty, but because Jesus was faithful. Jesus took upon that judgment onto himself. Jesus took on even death and won his victory. We will stand before God declared not guilty. And so then he continues, God presented Jesus as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in his blood. He did this to demonstrate his justice or righteousness, because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his justice at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. Where then is boasting? It is excluded. On what principle? On that of observing the law? No, but on that of faith. For we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from observing the law. Human beings don't like being given something good or being shown grace. We tend to feel like we owe somebody. If we were to go out to dinner and you were to say, I'm going to pick up the check, I'm going to hem and haw, I'm going to fight you on it. In a last-ditch effort, I'll at least offer to pay the tip because it's hard. I don't like feeling that vulnerability. Or you go over to somebody's house for dinner, and assuming the dinner is going even remotely well, what are you eventually going to talk about? Oh, next time we'll have you over. We'll provide this, that, or the other. It's a simple, dumb example, but it speaks to something deep. What God is saying is that there is nothing you can do to gain this verdict. You cannot earn the verdict of not guilty. It is out of your hands. It is given freely because God showed how he was going to be faithful to the promise he made by sending someone who is faithful, who takes on the vocation of humanity and Israel, who brings it all together and earns us the verdict that we cannot earn ourselves. That we who are baptized into Jesus' death and raised in that resurrection new life know that we have a verdict earned for us by Jesus, the faithful one to God's calling. That is what it means to be justified by faith. Let us pray.